when we started this tradition of reading to you, I thought it was going to be a series of sweet stories, but then all my colleagues surprised me with the most horrific stories I'd ever heard of. And of course, I'm an economist, so I need to keep up with the competition. So what I have for you tonight is a story that involves murder, rape, syphilis, shipwreck, earthquakes, and a couple of other terrible things. All this in the best of all possible tones. It is the English translation of 1759 Voltaire's Candide ou l'optimisme. In a castle of Westphalia, belonging to the Baron of Thunder ten Tronckh, lived a youth whom nature had endowed with the most gentle manners. His countenance was a true picture of his soul. He combined a true judgment with simplicity of spirit, which was the reason, I apprehend, of his being called Candide. The Baron was one of the most powerful lords in Westphalia, for his castle had not only a gate, but windows. His great hall even was hung with tapestry. They called him my lord, and laughed at all his stories. The Baron's lady weighed about 350 pounds, and was therefore a person of great consideration, and she did the honors of the house with a dignity that commanded still greater respect. Her daughter, Cunegonde, was 17 years of age, fresh-colored, comely, plump, and desirable. The preceptor Pangloss was the oracle of the family, and little Candide heard his lessons with all the good faith of his age and character. Pangloss was professor of metaphysico-theologico-cosmogoniology. He proved admirably that there is no effect without a cause, and that in this best of all possible worlds, the Baron's castle was the most magnificent of castles, and his lady the best of all possible baronesses. It is demonstrable, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than as they are. For all being created for an end, all is necessary for the best end. Observe that the nose has been formed to bear spectacles, thus we have spectacles. Legs are visibly designed for stockings, and we have stockings. Stones were made to be hewn, and to construct castles. Therefore, my lord has a magnificent castle, for the greatest baron in the province ought to be the best lodged. Pigs were made to be eaten, therefore we eat pork all year round. Consequently, they who assert that all is well have said a foolish thing. They should have said all is for the best. Candide listened attentively and believed innocently, for he thought Miss Cunegonde extremely beautiful, though he had never had the courage to tell her so. He concluded that after the happiness of being born of Baron of Thunder ten Tronckh, the second degree of happiness was to be Miss Cunegonde, the third that of seeing her every day, and the fourth that of hearing Master Pangloss, the greatest philosopher of the whole province and consequently of the whole world. One day Cunegonde, while walking near the castle in a little wood which they called the park, saw between the bushes Dr. Pangloss giving a lesson in experimental natural philosophy to her mother's chambermaid, a little brown wench, very pretty and very docile. As Miss Cunegonde had a great disposition for the sciences, she breathlessly observed the repeated experiments of which she was a witness. She clearly perceived the force of the doctor's reasons, the effects, and the causes. She turned back greatly flurried, quite pensive, and filled with the desire to be learned, dreaming that she might well be a sufficient reason for young Candide, and he for her. She met Candide on reaching the castle and blushed. Candide blushed also. She wished him good morrow in a faltering tone, and Candide spoke to her without knowing what he said. The next day after dinner, as they went from table, Cunegonde and Candide found themselves behind a screen. Cunegonde let fall her handkerchief. Candide picked it up. She took him innocently by the hand, the youth as innocently kissed the young lady's hand with particular vivacity, sensibility, and grace. Their lips met, their eyes sparkled, their knees trembled, their hands strayed. Baron Thunder ten Tronckh passed near the screen, and beholding the cause and effect, chased Candide from the castle with great kicks on the backside. Cunégonde fainted away. Candide, driven from terrestrial paradise, walked a long while without knowing where, weeping, raising his eyes to heaven, turning them often towards the most magnificent of castles which imprisoned the purest of noble young ladies. He lay down to sleep, without supper, in the middle of a field between two furrows. The snow fell in large flakes. Next day, Candide, all benumbed, dragged himself towards the neighboring town, which was called Waldberg Hoofdraad Bondigdorf, having no money, dying of hunger and fatigue. The next he addressed was a man who had been haranguing a large assembly for a while. The orator, looking askew, said, "What are you doing here? Are you for the good cause?" "There can be no effect without a cause," modestly answered Candide. "The whole is necessarily concatenated and arranged for the best. It was necessary for me to have been banished from the presence of Miss Cunégonde, and now it is necessary I should beg my bread until I learn to earn it. All this cannot be otherwise." "My friend," said the orator to him, "do you believe the Pope to be Antichrist?" "I have not heard it," answered Candide, "but whether he be, or whether he be not, I want bread." "Thou dost not deserve to eat," said the other. "Begone, rogue, begone, wretch, do not come near me again." A man who had never been christened, a good Anabaptist named James, beheld the cruel and ignominious treatment shown to one of his brethren. An unfeathered, biped, with a rational soul, he took him home, cleaned him, gave him bread and beer, presented him with 2 florins, and even wished to teach him the manufacture of Persian stuffs, which they make in Holland. Candide, almost prostrating himself before him, cried, "Master Pangloss has well said that all is for the best in this world, for I am infinitely more touched by your extreme generosity than with the inhumanity of that gentleman in the black coat." The next day, as he took a walk, he met a beggar, all covered with scabs, his eyes diseased, the end of his nose eaten away, his mouth distorted, his teeth black, choking in his throat, tormented with a violent cough, and spitting out a tooth at each effort. Candide, yet more moved with compassion than with horror, gave to the shocking beggar the 2 florins which he had received from the honest Anabaptist James. The spectre looked at him earnestly, dropping a few tears, and fell upon his neck. Candide recoiled in disgust. "Alas," said one wretch to the other, "do you no longer know your dear Pangloss?" "What do I hear? You, my dear master, you in this terrible plight, what misfortune has happened to you? Why are you no longer in the most magnificent of castles? What has become of Miss Cunégonde, the pearl of girls and nature's masterpiece?" "She is dead," replied the other. Candide fainted at this word. His friend recalled his senses with a little bad vinegar, which he found by chance in the stable. Candide reopened his eyes. "Cunégonde is dead? Ah, best of worlds, where art thou? But of what illness did she die? Was it not for grief, upon seeing her father kick me out of his magnificent castle?" "No," said Pangloss. "She was ripped open by the Bulgarian soldiers after having been violated by many. They broke the Baron's head for attempting to defend her. My lady, her mother, was cut in pieces, and as for the castle, they had not left one stone upon another, not a barn, nor a sheep, nor a duck, nor a tree." At this discourse Candide fainted again, but coming to himself, and having said all that it became him to say, inquired into the cause and effect, as well as into the sufficient reason that had reduced Pangloss to such a miserable plight. Alas, said the other, it was love. Love, the comfort of the human species, the preserver of the universe, the soul of all sensible things. Love, tender love. Alas, said Candide, I know this love, that sovereign of hearts, that soul of our souls, yet it never cost me more than a kiss and 20 kicks on the backside. How could this beautiful cause produce in you an effect so abominable? Pangloss made an answer in these terms. Oh, my dear Candide, you remember Paquette, that pretty wench who waited on our noble Baroness. In her arms I tasted the delights of paradise, which produced in me those hell torments with which you see me devoured. These last words determined Candide. He went and flung himself at the feet of the charitable Anabaptist James, and gave him so touching a picture of the state to which his friend was reduced, that the good man did not scruple to take Dr. Pangloss into his house, and had him cured at his expense. In the cure, Pangloss lost an eye and an ear. He wrote well, and knew arithmetic perfectly. The Anabaptist James made him his bookkeeper. At the end of 2 months, being obliged to go to Lisbon about some mercantile affairs, he took the 2 philosophers with him in his ship. Pangloss explained to him how everything was so constituted that it could not be better. James was not of this opinion. It is more likely, said he, mankind have a little corrupted nature, for they were not born wolves, and they have become wolves. God has given them neither cannon of 24-pounders nor bayonets, and yet they have made cannons and bayonets to destroy one another. All this was indispensable, replied the one-eyed doctor, for private misfortunes make the general good, so that the more private misfortunes there are, the greater is the general good. While he reasoned, the sky darkened, the winds blew from the 4 quarters, and the ship was assailed by a most terrible tempest within sight of the port of Lisbon. Half that of that inconceivable anguish which the rolling of a ship produces, 1/2 of the passengers were not even sensible of the danger. The other half shrieked and prayed, the sheets were rent, the masts broken, the vessel gaped. The Anabaptist, being upon deck, bore a hand, when a brutish sailor struck him roughly, and led him sprawling. But with the violence of the blow he himself tumbled head foremost overboard, and stuck upon a piece of the broken mast. Honest James ran to his assistance, hauled him up, and from the effort he made was precipitated into the sea in sight of the sailor, who left him to perish. Candide drew near, and saw his benefactor, who rose above the water one moment and was then swallowed up forever. He was just going to jump after him, but was prevented by the philosopher Pangloss, who demonstrated to him that the Bay of Lisbon had been made on purpose for the Anabaptist to be drowned. While he was proving this a priori, the ship foundered. All perished except Pangloss, Candide, and the brutal sailor who had drowned the good Anabaptist. As soon as they recovered themselves a little, they walked towards Lisbon. They had some money left with which they hoped to save themselves from starving, after they had escaped drowning. Scarcely had they reached the city, lamenting the death of their benefactor, when they felt the earth tremble under their feet. The sea swelled and foamed in the harbor, and beat to pieces the vessels riding at anchor. Whirlwinds of fire and ash covered the streets and public places. Houses fell, roofs were flung upon the pavements, and the pavements were scattered. 30,000 inhabitants of all ages and sexes were crushed under the ruins. The sailor, whistling and swearing, said there was booty to be gained here. After the earthquake had destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, the sages of that country could think of no means more effectual to prevent utter ruin than to give the people a beautiful auto da fe. For it had been decided by the University of Coimbra that the burning of a few people alive by a slow fire and with great ceremony is an infallible secret to hinder the earth from quaking. In consequence hereof, they had seized Dr. Pangloss and his disciple Candide, the one for speaking his mind, the other for having listened with an air of approbation. They marched in procession and heard a very pathetic sermon followed by fine church music. Candide was whipped while they were singing. Pangloss was hanged, though that was not the custom. The same day the earth sustained a most violent concussion. Candide, terrified, amazed, desperate, all bloody, all palpitating, said to himself, "If this is the best of possible worlds, what then are the others? If I had been only whipped, I could put up with it. But, O my dear Pangloss, thou greatest of philosophers, that I should have seen thou hanged, without knowing for what. O my dear Anabaptist, thou best of men, that thou shouldst have been drowned in the very harbour. O Miss Cunegonde, thou pearl of girls, that thou shouldst have had thy belly ripped open." Thus he was musing, scarce able to stand, preached at whipped, absolved, and blessed, when an old woman accosted him, saying, "My son, take courage and follow me." Candide did not take courage, but followed to a decayed house, where she gave him a pot of pomatum to anoint his sores, showed him a very neat little bed, with a suit of clothes hanging up, and left him something to eat and drink. "Eat, drink, sleep," said she, "and may our Lord of Atocha, the great Saint Anthony of Padua, and the great Saint James of Compostela receive you under their protection. I shall be back tomorrow." Candide, amazed at all he had suffered, and still more the charity of the old woman, wished to kiss her hand. "It is not my hand you must kiss," said the old woman. "I shall be back tomorrow. Anoint yourself with the pomatum, eat, and sleep." Okay, now we're skipping 15 chapters or so. In the middle of this dispute on the sea, they heard the report of cannon. It redoubled every instant. Each took out his glass. They saw two ships in close fight about 3 miles off. The wind brought both so near to the French vessel that our travellers had the pleasure of seeing the fight at their ease. At length one left off a broadside so low and so truly aimed that the other sank to the bottom. Candide and Martin could plainly perceive 100 men on the deck of the sinking vessel. They raised their hands to heaven and uttered terrible outcries, and the next moment were swallowed up by the sea. "Well," said Martin, "this is how men treat one another." The French captain soon saw that the captain of the victorious vessel was a Spaniard, and that the other was a Dutch pirate, and the very same one who had robbed Candide. The immense plunder which this villain had amassed was buried with him in the sea, and out of the whole only one sheep was saved. "You see," said Candide to Martin, "that crime is sometimes punished. This rogue of a Dutch skipper has met with the fate he deserved." "Yes," said Martin, "but why should the passengers be doomed also to destruction? God has punished the knave, and the devil has drowned the rest." "But for what end then has this world been formed?" said Candide. "To plague us to death," answered Martin. "Do you believe," said Candide, "that men have always massacred each other, as they do today? That they have always been liars, cheats, traitors, ingrates, brigands, idiots, thieves, scoundrels, gluttons, drunkards, misers, envious, ambitious, bloody-minded fanatics, hypocrites, and fools?" "Do you believe," said Martin, "that hawks have always eaten pigeons when they have found them?" "Yes, without doubt," said Candide. "Well then," said Martin, "if hawks have always had the same character, why should you imagine that men may have changed theirs?" And towards the end of the book, while Candide, the Baron, Pangloss, Martin, and Cacambo were relating their several adventures, were reasoning on the contingent or non-contingent events of the universe, disputing on effects and causes, on moral and physical evil, on liberty and necessity, and on the consolations a slave may feel even on this Turkish galley, they arrived at the house of the Transylvanian prince on the banks of the Propontis. The first objects which met their sight were Cunegonde and the old woman, hanging towels out to dry. The Baron paled at this sight. The tender, loving Candide, seeing his beautiful Cunegonde embrowned with bloodshot eyes, withered neck, wrinkled cheeks, and rough red arms, recoiled 3 paces, seized with horror, and then advanced out of good manners. There was a small farm in the neighborhood, which the old woman proposed to Candide to make a shift with, till the company could be provided for in a better manner. Cunegonde did not know she had grown ugly, for nobody had told her of it. And she reminded Candide of his promise to marry her in so positive a tone that the good man durst not refuse her. He therefore intimated to the Baron that he intended to marrying his sister. "I will not suffer," said the Baron, "such meanness on her part, and such insolence on yours. I will never be reproached with this scandalous thing." "Thou foolish fellow," said Candide, "I have delivered thee out of the galleys. I have paid thy ransom and thy sister's too. She was a scullion and is very ugly, yet I am so condescending as to marry her. And dost thou pretend to oppose the match? I should kill thee again, were I only to consult my anger." "Thou mayest kill me again," said the Baron, "but thou shalt not marry my sister, at least while I am living." It is natural to imagine that after so many disasters, Candide married, and living with the philosopher Pangloss, the philosopher Martin, the prudent Cacambo, and the old woman, having besides brought so many diamonds from the country of the ancient Incas, must have led a very happy life. But he was so much imposed upon by the Jews that he had nothing left except his small farm. His wife became uglier every day, more peevish and unsupportable. The old woman was infirm and even more fretful than Cunegonde. Cacambo, who worked in the garden and took vegetables for sale to Constantinople, was fatigued with hard work and cursed his destiny. Pangloss was in despair at not shining in some German university. For Martin, he was firmly persuaded that he would be as badly off elsewhere, and therefore bore things patiently. Pangloss, Candide, and Martin, returning to the little farm, saw a good old man taking the fresh air at his door under an orange bower. Pangloss, who was as inquisitive as he was argumentative, asked the old man what was the name of the strangled Mufti. "I do not know," answered the worthy man, "and I have not known the name of any Mufti. I am entirely ignorant of the event you mention. I presume, in general, that they who meddle with the administration of public affairs die sometimes miserably and that they deserve it. But I never trouble my head about what is transacting at Constantinople. I content myself with sending there for sale the fruits of the garden which I cultivate." Having said these words, he invited the strangers into his house. His 2 sons and 2 daughters presented him with several sorts of sherbet which they made themselves. "You must have a vast and magnificent estate," said Candide to the Turk. "I have only 20 acres," replied the old man. "I and my children cultivate them. Our labor preserves us from 3 great evils: weariness, vice, and want." Candide, on his way home, made profound reflections on the old man's conversation. "This honest Turk," said he to Pangloss and Martin, "seems to be in a situation far preferable to that of the 6 kings with whom we had the honor of supping." "Grandeur," said Pangloss, "is extremely dangerous according to the testimony of philosophers." "I know also," said Candide, "I know also that we must cultivate our garden." "You are right," said Pangloss, "for man was first placed in the Garden of Eden. He was put there ut operaretur eum, that he might cultivate it. which shows that man was not born to be idle. Let us work, said Martin, without disputing. It is the only way to render life tolerable. The whole little society entered into this laudable design, according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land produced plentiful crops. Cunegonde was, indeed, very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery, the old woman looked after the linen. They were all of some service or other. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, "There's a concatenation of events in this best of all possible worlds. For if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here, eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts." "All that is very well," answered Candide, "but let us cultivate our garden."